Welcome to yet another video where we are learning more about FileMaker Pro. I'm guessing that's why you clicked on this video, and that's what we're going to do. My name is Matt Petrowski, and I'm bringing you these videos from my desktop. And in today's lesson, we're continuing with a series that we have going on about data and structure. We're taking a look at adding value lists. Now, we've done this before, but it never hurts to do it again. So stick with me. We'll be on my desktop in just a few. All right, so welcome back to my desktop where we are going to learn more about FileMaker Pro. Now, in the description below this video, there is a link that you can get access to the file that we're going to be using for this video if you want to follow along. Always a good idea because it helps you learn more about FileMaker, especially if you're a FileMaker learner. If you already know FileMaker, then maybe you'll pick up an extra tip or two. Also, if you found this video as the result of a search, then you can always click on the channel icon here on YouTube and it'll take you to my channel where you'll have a list of the different series that I post. So when this video has a number like number 20 and you want to go back to number 1, it's a very easy way to find that video. I'm also going to ask you to help me with something. I have noticed there was a comment on a video that I shot yesterday that I was talking about describing a FileMaker problem. And I don't typically watch my own videos, and oh my gosh, I was horrified at how many times I use the word actual, actually, actual this, actual that, actual that. So I'm going to do something here. Anytime that I say actually, it's almost like I want to do this. Yeah, I just don't want to hear that from myself, or I'm going to pay attention to actually not using that word as frequently so that I can mix things up. Thank you, Gordon, for actually making that mention to me because I don't typically watch my videos. When I did, whoosh, yeah, I like that word. All right, so let's switch into FileMaker and let's take a look at what we are talking about today. So I'm going to show my window of the database that you're going to have access to if you click on that link. And we are going to be implementing finally our filter on our value list. So our objective was, after implementing what we have right here with the checkboxes, and if you watched that previous video, you'll know that one of the things that I had done on the checkbox is in order to use this, I used a little character. Well, mine isn't actually showing right here. Let me open up my keyboard preferences and make sure and turn that on. You can do that right there in the keyboard settings here on the Macintosh. I don't know why mine resets every day, but it does. But once we've got it right up here in the top corner of my menu bar, I can actually, boo! I can show the emoji and symbols, and when they come up, then I can choose from any of these, a myriad of characters that I can use in the Boolean values. Now, the ones that I used, which were they? They were the, I don't know, we'll just go to the emoji. The ones that I'd used were a checkbox, and I liked the checkbox, but I didn't like the version that was unchecked. So in other words, what we were looking at is I liked this checkbox right here, but I didn't like this version right here. Now remember, anytime that you're going to use these characters, they have to be represented in the font that you choose. So this may not be working on Windows if you're opening this file. I'm showing this on a Macintosh. So unfortunately, when I go into layout mode and I zoom in right here on projects, excuse me, I am not getting a good reflection of what I want this to do. So I have added a button here, and we talked about this just another couple of videos ago. Go watch video 18 or video 19 where you'll see that I talked about I prefer a native object, and what I've got is a button here, and that button has a merge field on top of it. That merge field, in turn, using the inspector, is formatted, which we took a look at before. And I go to the fourth area right here, and I need to collapse these. It is formatted as a Boolean, and you can put the two variations. You can put the checked and the unchecked. Well, what I did is I didn't like that the unchecked version, so I basically put nothing. That nothing now allowed me to put just a regular rectangle behind it. So if you move this off to the side, you'll see that there's a rectangle behind the button. not the actual button, which I was tempted to say. All right, so that's my little fix right there. But again, on Windows, we're going to have a problem with that because we can't always rely that the font is going to be consistent across the platforms. So if I want this to work on both platforms, I'm going to be changing this and using probably a different technique. I referred to it. You can find it on the magazine website where I use the SVG icons. These right here, where you can choose, when you double click on a button, the button setup to choose not an actual icon, but just an icon. Undo that. All right, so we now need to filter our value list so that our value list is only going to show the active items. In order to do that, it's really simple. We've been doing it before, but once we get into a complex graph, things can look pretty confusing, especially for a new FileMaker learner. Now, when we talked about yesterday, I talked about describing a problem and using relationships for the purpose of filtering. We're doing the same thing here, but what we need to do is consider what is it that we want to filter on. And anytime, like I stated in yesterday's video, you just walk through the process in your head asking the question. I want to find only those active projects. And you think about all of the pieces of information that you described when you basically told yourself what you wanted to do. Projects and active. And what do I use to manage my projects as the developer? The project ID. So those are my two pieces of information that are going to allow me to filter things out. Now I already have a value list, I believe, associated to this. We can take a look by going to the fourth area of the inspector, looking at the field. We do have the value list called projects. We can access that here. Or of course, we can always go to Manage and Value Lists, same way to get there. Once we're in there, we can take a look at the value list and what we had formerly set up in a previous video. And we can see that what we are doing is we are, of course, as a developer, we are using IDs behind the scenes, we're using keys, and then we are also using the name field. And we are choosing this option to show values only from the second field so that the name displays, but the key is returned. Now we are including all values from the name field. So we of course now want a smaller list of values, only those that are active. So we have to create our relationship that's going to facilitate the filter that will get us to the point where we only show the active items. So we need to create a new relationship, because we don't currently have one. So this happens often in FileMaker. You get to the point where you say, I need to get some data, and you ask yourself, is the data currently on my graph and accessible via some existing relationship? If it's not, then you're going to have to you're going to have to build that relationship. Now I get to choose at this point whether I want to use my current graph or whether I want to keep things separate and off of the graph. So I'm going to do that. In this particular case, my context is this item right here. It's the layout that's tied, my layout is tied to this table occurrence, and I want to, many times your value list will have to be derived from within your interconnected group of table occurrences. But when I discussed value lists in a previous video, especially when you're using a self-relationship for a value list or a single values table, that's really valuable when you have discrete custom values that you want to control that aren't necessarily value lists that need to be derived from your data. In this case, they are going to be derived from my data, but they're not specific to the context that I'm that I'm working in. So I'm going to create a separate group of table occurrences. I'm going to take this one, and then I'm going to filter based on that, based on the active. So in order to do this, I need to have a starting point. In order to find or see only the active items, that either has to come from my data or I have to explicitly put it into my solution. Meaning, in the affirmative, I only want to see active projects in my value list, or I only want to see inactive projects. Now we've taken a look at this in a previous video, and what this is going to require is it requires us to have what in the rest of programming is called a constant. And in the world of FileMaker, a constant is typically just an unstored calculated value that is set to a fixed value. Now, we could use an unstored, but I'm not going to do that right now. What I'm going to choose to do instead is I'm going to choose to use a global field, and I'm going to use that global field because I might, in the future, when I think about the problem, would there be a time where I might want to inverse this and not see just active projects, but maybe I want to choose or see inactive projects. So that type of decision makes this a much more flexible solution. Rather than adding a global field or an unstored calculated field that always evaluates to 1, because we know that we're using a Boolean value on our project, we're we are using that value, projects. I need a projects window. There we have one right there. We are using this active field as a number field, and it's a Boolean. We talked about that with Boolean checkboxes just a few videos ago. So we need a value that's going to allow us to always show the active or always show the inactive. So the question now is, where's the best place to put this value list? Should I wire it up into my graph, or should I start to create a separate group of table occurrences for the purpose of simply knowing that my value lists are not commingled within my graph? And ultimately, that's the decision that I make. I decide to make a separate group of table occurrences for my value list. So as I take a copy of my globals and then I take a copy of my time, I'm going to rename this to values globals, and I'm going to call this one values. Actually, what I need this to be based off of is projects, because that's what I'm dealing with. That's where my values are coming from. So I'm going to select projects, and I'm going to rename the last value in that to directly correspond to my base table name. So now all I need is that field. I need the field that's going to allow me to filter based on the status of the project. Now here's a key thing to think about whenever you're creating these types of structures. I always do this when I'm developing in FileMaker. You try to make your solution as flexible as possible so that you can give the user obviously as much power as possible, but you also try to make it easier on yourself and not add too much stuff. So if you think in terms of specifics, many times you're just adding a global field and then you're onto a new problem and you're thinking in terms of the specifics of that new problem, and you just add a new global field and another new global field and another regular field and field and field and field and field. You end up adding all of these fields. Your solution grows, and it grows beyond the point of your mental capability to think about everything that's going on. And then you're overwhelmed. You don't know what's being used currently, what's been added that's new to your solution, and it's a big hassle. So at this point, when I'm going to create this value list, I start to think, could I use a single global field for many different value lists, knowing that if I'm only going to display the value list at a given point in time, that value can serve a dual or a triple or a quadruple purpose. And that's a really good way to go about programming your FileMaker database. Because I'm going to make a choice, in this case, I'm probably leaning towards using that popover that we have for the display of the projects. It might work out that I could use a global field that could just serve as a utility global field for any time that I want to see anything that is a switch-based field with a 1 versus a 0. Rather than thinking about my specific problem of I just want to see active versus inactive, specifically relating to projects. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does, because it makes your solution a little bit more trim. So after that long dissertation, let's go add the field. We go to our globals, and we are now going to, rather than saying active versus inactive, because it's specific to that, I start to think in terms of utility. I think in terms of something like this. Now, if doing this, if that doesn't help you, if you like the underscore like I'm adding right now, you can do that. Type, Matt. True, false. So there's a downside to this. When I start to go generic, it takes the specificity out of the problem that I'm trying to solve, and sometimes that makes it harder to find things within your FileMaker solution because you end up saying, why is this relationship wired up based on a field called TrueFalse? And I'll need to make it a number, so make sure and make that a number. We'll change that. We'll click on our options right here. We will go to our storage. We will choose our global storage. We will say OK, and we now have our global number, treating it as a utility field for the purpose of being able to do multiple different potential filterings. Now, as I head down this path and I'm thinking about this from the context of how it's going to be used. I may be branching off here mentally, and again, I'm shooting these videos live, so you're getting me developing, thinking as I develop, remembering things that I do typically. In this scenario, it might not work. Well, it'll work initially when we wire it up, but it might not be something that I want to do. But the cool thing is I can always rename this. I can switch it back to be something specific to finding projects. Now, the thought process is, why would we want it to be specific to projects? Hopefully you come up with the same answer that I have in my head, because it specifically deals with a value list. So my thought process and everything that I've been telling you about using a utility field here or using a utility global probably won't work in this scenario, but everything I gave you with regards to the advice of treating fields or reflecting off of the specific and going to the general applies, and it's something that you will end up using. So I might even want to just leave this here, or I'll leave it called true false, and we'll learn through the experience of building it, hey, maybe I do want to actually have that, maybe I do want to have that situation be the case. All right, so we need to now filter based on only active projects. It's really pretty easy. We are going to go from true false to active. True false being a global field can be either true or false. That means I can get just my active projects. It's super simple. I am doing it with a disconnected group of table occurrences. Again, we're going to need to apply some structure to this graph. It's going to get pretty messy, and I want to be able to have this off to, off somewhere else. Now, typically, what I do is I've explained this in the previous video. Go back to my environment series and watch what I do with regards to the graph and how I organize. Pretty much I keep everything within columns. So this column right here within the graph is used for me as a developer for my development tables and for typically value lists. Then I have a second column right here. So this highlighter isn't showing you columns, but I'm showing you the columns when I'm going up and down here with the cursor. So that means I need to rearrange a little bit here. I'm going to grab my items. I'm going to put this one, put it within this column right here. Select my align left edges. I'll take the time right now, resize to largest width. This is a utility window. I'll probably want to add a little note icon on that. Again, I'll select here. I will align to the left and resize to the smallest width in this case to shrink those down and start to give my graph a little bit more organization, because we're now getting to the point where this is going to need to be refined. Now, if you haven't watched the video where I do this process, go ahead and watch that, because it's going to help you out. You get to choose how you want to perceive this graph or how you want to see what's going on. Right now, my alignment or my orientation of objects doesn't necessarily follow what's called a anchor buoy model to graph organization. That's because my anchor is typically the table occurrence that is used for the layout. So in this case, it would fall within the second column right here, and then I would have my data item, this is my data structure right here. Then I would have my utility or my user interface, my globals right here, maybe off to the side. So this organization for the graph where you have, as I was stating, column, 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 and then column is a little bit easier to follow, especially for somebody else coming into the graph new without having seen it, and especially when you put labels. All right, so let's go modify our value list. And we're going to go to our manage and our value lists. We're in here now, and let's go change what is derived. Actually, gosh, I love that word. All right, so with our value list, we always have a starting point and an ending point. You can see that we were formerly basing this straight off of a developer table. We need to switch our context. It's going to be coming from, look at that, with the naming of the prefixes, really helpful when you use those prefixes. We want it to come from values project now and values project. We want to deselected my ID. I want to have my ID selected, and I want my name. I want to show values from selected, and I want to change this from include all values to include only related values starting from the globals context. And so that should give us just our active projects. So this has been a long road to get to this point to just be able to filter this list based on active projects. Now I can see that something's going on here. Maybe I'm doing something funky in terms of my projects. That would make sense. So if you're following along and you make this switch, these are part of the things that make you confused when you're working with FileMaker. Formerly, I had a list that was selected that was pointing to the name of projects. I switched the value list now to be related, and now it's just showing me an ID. And as a new FileMaker learner, I might be like, whoa, I set this up based on IDs, and I remember that, but what the heck is going on here? You always have to remember what you're doing as you're working in FileMaker. When we made the switch to tie the value list off of the relationship right here, and let's move this out a little bit so we can see the connections. When we changed this the value list so that we wired it up on this disconnected table occurrence group for the purpose of keeping it out of our graph, what happened was I don't have a value in TrueFalse. There's no resolution on this relationship. So you have to think about all the parts of what you're building. So all I'm going to need is a TrueFalse value in this. And one of the things that we think about whenever we're developing in FileMaker is what happens the very first time the user gets into this solution. If this TrueFalse value does not actually have a value, when the solution was brand new opened, and if there were no records and they created projects, but they wanted to be able to see projects to select from, we need to have that value have a value. So we take the time, we go to our tables, we go to our globals, we go to our TrueFalse, and we say, what do we want to have it be as the default? We auto enter, and we can basically say, we want all of the true values. Watch, what I'm going to do is switch from actually to using basically all the time. Hey, I'm willing to learn, and I want to get better. A better presenter makes me able to convey more information to you. All right, we go to our globals table. So I access that with Command-Shift-L to bring up our layouts. We can see that we are in our globals, and we go to our fields, and we option drag to create a new copy of the TrueFalse. I don't like seeing the label, so, and it's also not, well, the globals, maybe it's helpful. It's helpful on the globals table. On other tables, I'm usually looking at it in table view, and it really doesn't help me out because I already have, the table view has the headers on those items by default. All right, so let's put a value in of 1 and see if that fixes up our value list. Cool, these are our active projects, and I can select this, and now it's going to show that. So I should be able to do exactly what I want to do in my user interface, is I should be able to say project 1 and project 2 are active, and I should be able to select on this. I don't. This is a problem that you're going to come across commonly when you're working with FileMaker, and especially value lists. What happened here? Why, when I selected my projects, did that not show up? Clicking between these two, what's happened, I believe, is the record has not been committed, or FileMaker has not had the opportunity to update the value list. So if I click out here, and then I click on the menu, project 1 and 2 becomes available. So this is something you always have to remember when it comes to value lists when you're working where a user can make changes to what a value list should render. When I click here and I say I want project 3 and 5 to show, currently FileMaker may not have committed the data. So what happens is you need to make sure that you're going to cause FileMaker to update the value list. Now this can happen in a variety of ways. One of the easiest ways when you're working with a popover is the popover, basically all objects on FileMaker have the ability to trigger a script based on some type of action. In a popover, it's really easy. In layout mode, we double click on the button that is the popover, then we select the popover and we double click on that. Or you can right click on the popover and choose your script triggers. Script triggers is the one way that you're going to be able to tell FileMaker, I want you to commit what was just done by the user, flush the data, update the value list so that when the user goes to select something else, the value list is refreshed. Boy, I will defeat this. Actual use. All right, here we go. We could choose on object exit. So on object exit, we could choose to have a script that will commit. And it's really simple. We can do that right now. Let's click this right there. We will click to create a new script and we will simply call it commit. And we will add the single step of commit, records request. We can turn that off. And then we can say OK, and we can say OK. So what happens now, as I get rid of the inspector and I go into browse mode, now what happens is when I click on this object, the popover comes up. I uncheck project 4, 3, 2, and 1. And let's make sure that only one of them is going to show. Maybe these down at the bottom, these 4. My project, add new project, other, and more. When I directly click over here, what happens as a byproduct of this popover closing, it runs the script. The script only runs a single step of commit that forces FileMaker to have the new data, that defines the new value list, and it should be updated. So that's the solution right there that you always have to know whenever you're working with value lists. If the record doesn't get committed, that's very confusing for new FileMaker learners when the very first time that they try something, their value list hasn't been updated and they're very confused at why aren't the values there? I know that the relationship is set up the way that it should be. And that's the solution. You just have to commit those records. Let's uncheck those 4 and we want project 11, 7, and 2 and 3. We select, boom, they're there, and we've got exactly what we want. So just remember, anytime you're working with a value list, you're going to typically need a commit somewhere to get FileMaker to refresh and update that value list. All right, that's going to do it for today's list. That's one thing. We've got a lot of things to clean up in this database, by the way. That's one thing right here that as you implement features and functionality into your FileMaker database, when you add new features, you many times cause new problems. For example, we have a couple of problems right now. One, I can't add a new project. I can't click into a field right here because the relationship that's used in order to allow the creation of related records through the relationship is not satisfied because I don't have any records currently loaded. And that might be the case. So that's a problem I have to solve. The other problem is if a selection from this pop-up menu was formerly a valid value according to my value list, but then I make it non-valid, I have to account for that and I have to fix the situation because this doesn't work for the user. If formerly this was selected to project 1 and then I just checked project 1 and made it inactive, and then this closes and now this renders, no user wants to see this funky ID, so you have to put that into the logic of your script. You have to solve these UI problems so that everything works out the way that you want. But that's what happened right there. I had unchecked a project that formerly was active and selected, and it became inactive. So what I'll probably end up doing is having a much more complex script that runs on object exit for the popover that switches this. Or I come up with an alternative method for the user to work within the user interface, which is usually the case. If you didn't know this, I am actually building a mess in this file just for you so that we can take the opportunity to clean it up in terms of what we're going to do. All right, so let's take a look and see if we have any questions that came in as a result of our related value list today. As we switch over and we take a look. All right, we've got our standard mornings. Actually, we never noticed. Oh my gosh, go back and just watch yesterday's video. I must use the word actually probably 5 times within 5 sentences. That means it's appearing once per sentence. Saying basically is a lot worse. All right, I'm going to work hard on this because I want to be a good presenter, ladies and gentlemen. All right. By the way, to close the subject about my statistical observation with UUID, chances of repetition are 1 and over 2.7x 10 to the 28th quintillion. That's awesome. So right there, see that comment? When you want to know something in FileMaker, go do your search. In fact, on Wikipedia, they probably have all kinds of stuff about UUIDs, and it's, I mean, you just won't come across duplicates. You don't have to worry. New issues are usually good. It means you are going forward. Old ones are quite boring. Excellent comment, Hermund. That's what I love about FileMaker. FileMaker, when you add things in and you have to solve new problems, it causes you to start to think in a FileMaker way. And the more and more solutions that you have, the better and better you become as a developer. I guess I'm used to your probably actuallys. Would you expand on why a constant of 1 should be unstored? Yeah, there's a couple of ways that you can you can create a constant. Let's take a look at those since we're here. In our file, now what I've chosen to do, or what I chose to show you in this video, in the tables, is I chose within the globals to use a global field. But let's talk about constants for just a short bit. A constant can be anything that stays constant. And most of the time, that's a calculated field. And when you make it an unstored calculated field, it acts the same way that a global field does. If I changed this right now, and this is a great thing to do, change this to a calculated value, say OK, put the literal value, not the actual value, of 1, choose my storage options, and then choose do not store. The reason that I want to make it an unstored is because as a constant, it's the same across all records. If I leave this calculation such that it can store the value, that means that on one record, I could potentially have a 1, and on another record, I could potentially have a 0. Now, even though the auto enter for this field, or the value, well, in the case of a stored calculation, it's not going to be the case because the calculation is saying always be a 1 in this case. So in this exact example, it doesn't really matter whether it would be stored or unstored. But for the sake of the relationship, being unstored is the same thing as having a global field that is a value of 1. It's just a value that's basically in memory, and it's not something that FileMaker has to look at on a record-by-record basis. But with a stored calculation, I believe FileMaker has to look at it on from a record-from-record basis, because each record could potentially be a different value if it's a stored calculation. And hopefully that makes sense. Meaning the calculation, if FileMaker is going to evaluate the calculation itself could return a differing result, whereas with an unstored, it cannot. And with a global, it cannot. So in terms of using a value for the purpose of a constant, I shouldn't call a global field constant because it can vary. I think of it in terms of a constant because it's almost, in this situation, almost always going to be 1, but the way that I'm using it, it could also be a 0, meaning I could look at my non-active projects. So I should probably use a different term for that, and I probably should stick to, if I'm going to say a constant in FileMaker, a constant is always an unstored calculated field. That's because A stored calculated field could vary, probably not if you're going to put in a forced value, but a global field itself cannot necessarily be a constant by virtue of the fact that it can vary. So probably something we should do. One of the really bad things, one of the reasons that I actually in 2010 wrote FileMaker or created the website FileMakerStandards.org, there is nothing that covers this. From developer to developer to developer, they all do things differently. And there's really no standards. And the reason that I was prompted to do that back in 2010 was I was working with a PHP system called Drupal, and the most beautiful thing about many other programming languages is that they have standards. And if you stick to those standards, then everybody else understands everybody else's code, and it makes it so much easier. But FileMaker just has the environment of FileMaker has a really hard time because you have so many different developers that are just really stuck on their system and won't necessarily adapt. And who am I to say, hey, adapt and use mine? I'm going to show you mine, but so be it. So the relationship still works, even though I've got a unstored constant. But that's a good question, and I hopefully clarified that up. See if we got any more questions that came in before we wrap it up. David asks, what is the difference between enter find mode to perform a script versus global calculated value linked to TO? The difference is basically what it comes down to what you have to manage. That's how I think of things in FileMaker. Do I have to manage a script? Do I have to manage a relationship? Do I have to manage a layout? Do I have to manage whatever it is that you add? That's what you have to manage, and that usually is the primary difference other than performance. Performance comes into play when you have to think about, in this case, of a value list. Let's say, for example, in order for FileMaker to evaluate the value list, if it has to evaluate a group of interconnected table occurrences, it has to go through a lot of those and say, how complex is this? What data am I getting from these? And what does it take in order for me to return a result or to jump to a set of records using a goTo related? As opposed to, let's say, a find, where a find is, hey, FileMaker, just go get me these records and do it based on this field, which is indexed. So many times a find will end up being faster in the long run, mostly because of what you add to the graph in terms of complexity. But once you really understand the graph, if you know that your graph is not actually if it's not that complex, and you know that you're using, say, for example, global Cartesian joins where you're joining nothing to very little of something, you know that your graph doesn't carry that much impact. So these all come about after you start to feel the pain of certain things slowing down, and you start to discover where and what's making them slow down. So hopefully just understanding that an enter find mode and performing a find is going to be a little bit faster in most situations, but it's not a blanket statement. You don't always use a find over a relationship, because most of the time, in order to truly display what you want on your user interface, you have to add relationships. So it's sort of like a catch-22, and you sort of learn as you develop where you want to put your effort, whether you want to use the find or whether you want to use the relationship and you want to script it. All right, so I think that's going to give us a wrap for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. Thank you for helping me with actually. But if you'd like, you can check out, you can basically subscribe here on YouTube, and the next video that I come up with in this series will come up right there, and you're always welcome to check out FileMakerMagazine.com for more FileMaker goodies. Much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy file making.